Working. Is it working? Hello?
Can you guys? Thanks everybody. Oh, okay. You guys can hear everyone, right? Yeah? Okay. Thank you for coming. Thank you for staying. Let's do some introductions before we get started. I feel like this mic is not working, but I will talk very loud. Lindsay.
Hello.
Oh, no. More important to hear you. This is Lindsay Berra. That's Gal Berra.
Go Yankees. We'll talk loud. Hello.
Yeah.
I lived on the Upper West Side from '99 to '06.
Same here.
Is that right? Can you hear me now?
Oh, yeah.
Somebody turn
yeah.
I turned on the volume.
Yes, they're working.
Okay.
Great, okay.
First, wait, I actually do have a question I didn't ask you last time. The Lenny Kravitz song that we just heard.
Oh my God.
So this was one of the things that was great about COVID because it gave us like way lots of extra time to work on licensing of things.
Yeah.
But this Lenny song, we were trying to get in touch with the agent. It was like we didn't know him, so I just wrote this like incredibly long and heartfelt letter, basically begging him to let us use Lenny's song, and we just started blasting it out to random email addresses that we thought might belong to his agent, and then in snail mail too.
Yeah.
And we finally ended up getting an email back, and they were okay with us, were willing to give us the rights to the song. But then British Music Group swooped in and was like, no, he can't give you the rights. He doesn't own the rights. Those are our rights. And it was this whole debacle.
Was that your question? How we got the rights or what?
Well, it ain't over till it's over. It's so associated with Yogi
Yeah.
Berra. I'm amazed your family actually doesn't get a cut of just the title of
I
the
think
song.
we're amazed too.
We use that as leverage to get a good deal on the song. Put it that way.
It is true. I know that you guys have been everywhere talking about this movie, and the feedback has been incredible. So many fans coming up to you, telling you what it's meant, your dad has meant to them, what your grandpa's meant to them. But let's see, tell me again, Sean, what does Mr. Rogers have to do with what we just saw?
Mr. Rogers has a lot to do with a lot of things, actually, it turns
Yes.
out. And this film in particular, our producer, Peter Sobolov, he was, quote unquote, dragged to the theater in the summer 2018 to see the Mr. Rogers documentary by his wife on a Sunday, kicking and screaming. And he left absolutely in love with the film. He just absolutely enthralled. And the next day, he went to the Yogi Berra charity golf event and was talking with Dale and some of the other folks there. And just was wondering why there hadn't been a movie like that about Yogi. And so this was back in July of 18, and we all just started talking. I had made a film with Peter beforehand, and so he thought I'd be a great director for this, and I came on board and met with Larry, Tim, and Dale, and then eventually Lindsay, and got to work.
Lindsay, now, was anything off limits in terms of Yogi's life?
No.
No. Dale? Dale,
He literally didn't do anything that had to be hidden. There was nothing he ever did that was off limits.
but we even hear about what happened with the intervention with you, like, you were okay even including something like that, obviously.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Our first shoot day, actually. So we got the call to do this in summer of 18, and then we tried to put the money together, and that was really difficult. And I hadn't marked on my calendar May of 19, which I knew from talking with Dale was his book launch. And so I told my producers, we need to be financed by May. So that was my mantra all winter. We were not financed. Nobody, it was hard to get money for an independent. We made this film completely independently, outside the system, all friends and family money. So this is an independent film at its heart. So thank you for supporting it, by the way. It means a lot to us. But finally, Dale's book signing was coming up in May, and that was our first shoot. And it was really it's in the film, So, everything was on the table, and they, I had full kind of final cut of the film. But at the same time, I ran a cut by, Lindsay and Larry before we locked it, and it went well.
And we see throughout the movie what a character he was outside of just being this incredible baseball player. Because he was a character, do you think that's why you don't think he got the respect that he deserved ultimately?
I just think that Grandpa played his last game on May 9th, 1965, and he played for 18 years in the big leagues. But then for 50 years, he was managing, so talking to the press a lot more and making commercials, and he really kind of became a pop culture icon. He was quoted by, all those presidents you see in the film, and I think there's a bit of a recency bias. That's what's most upfront in people's memories. He most recently was the funny pitchman, and the amazing stuff that he did on the baseball field is in the much more distant past. So unless you're 60 years old and went to a lot of ball games as a kid, or if you're under 50 or 60, you have to have an older relative who's doing a really good job of educating you about baseball history to really understand how great Grandpa was. But I think the movie does a good job of showing just how great he was on the baseball field, but then obviously also showing that as good as he was an even better human being.
Is that also, you think, because of the All-Star game, the same thing that happened, just the recency bias? Why he wasn't on the field that day?
Yeah, I would think so. That was a fan vote. I do question if MLB had themselves picked that, if they would have included him, but they also could have seen the votes and then just added him as a fifth person.
Right, seriously.
I don't really know.
Assuming he was fifth.
Well, yeah.
Of all those rings, did he have a favorite championship?
Yes. The Yogi Berra Museum and Learning Center, if you've never been, is in Montclair, New Jersey. You should all come out and visit us. It's a great place. But we have all 27 Yankees championship rings, and the 10 that Grandpa won are highlighted in yellow. And I always tell all the little kids who come that you can't wear 10 rings all at once like he is in the movie poster, because that would just be tacky. So he wore the 1953 ring on his pinky. It was the first and only time teams had won 5 World Series in a row, 49, 50, 51, 52, 53. There were 13 guys who were on all 5 of those rosters, and they had a ring with the number 5 on it, and that was the one ring that Grandpa wore on his pinky his entire life.
Dale, yes? You agree?
Yeah, I definitely agree. That 5 ring on his pinky used to fit. By the way, my dad was so strong, and his hands were so thick that even when I was an adult, that number 5 ring fit on my thumb, and he wore it on his pinky. So
he had paws. We show that picture in the film of his hands like this. He had these big meat hook hands.
This picture to me is just a feel-good story about the great American dream. And my dad lived that. A young man who grew up in a place called Dago Hill in St. Louis, who didn't speak English till he was 10 years old. He had to quit school in the 8th grade to bring a paycheck home to his family, and actually went to work in a shoe factory when he was 14 years old. And 4 years later, he finds himself charging the beaches of Normandy and invading northern Africa and southern Italy. He comes back home and wins 10 World Series rings, 3 MVPs, appears in 18 consecutive All-Star games. He becomes an American icon, one of the most quoted men in the world, not just the United States, in the world. And he wins the Presidential Medal of Freedom, or is awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And that, to me, that's an amazing accomplishment from a young man who was the second born in the United States of his whole family.
I was really surprised. I did not know that he stormed the beaches of Normandy. Was that something that he talked a lot about? Because some veterans don't like to talk about what happened.
He rarely talked about it. He talked about the incredible will and the, Sean, who went to West Point, by the way, I'm sure understands the mentality of the next man in front of you, and that person, and you do what he does, kind of a
Next man up.
Yeah, that next man up thing. And Dad used to often talk about the amazing camaraderie that he had with his fellow sailors. So he didn't talk much about it, but it was definitely a memorable event in his life. And he took a bullet in his thumb, and he had the scar on it to prove it, and several on his boat were killed.
It's amazing that it was such a different time. Like you couldn't imagine any baseball player these days going off, and people did it all the time in World War II. It was different era. What was it like, Lindsay, being at that ceremony that we see at the end to get the Presidential Medal of Freedom?
It was actually a really cool day. My dad and I went in early to, and you guys are baseball fans of this room?
Go Yankees,
Yeah. So the French ambassador was there, and it was the whole day was delayed. The ceremony was supposed to start at 1, and it didn't actually start until 4. So we spent 3 extra hours in like the holding rooms with all these other folks who were getting the Medal of Freedom, which included Steven Spielberg, Willie Mays, James Taylor, Yitzhak Perlman, the Nobel Prize winning violinist, Katherine Johnson, the black woman mathematician who basically put Neil Armstrong on the moon from Hidden Figures. So all these really cool people. And we had gone through security with Kate Capshaw and Steven Spielberg. And my dad is from, he was born in St. Louis. Kate Capshaw is from St. Louis. And he says to Steven Spielberg, he's like, Steven, I've had a big crush on your wife my whole life. And he was like, we'll talk to her. So we kind of made friends with them going through security. And a little while later, Willie Mays comes in and he's in his wheelchair and he has really bad cataracts. He doesn't see very well. And Steven Spielberg sees my dad go over and talk to Willie. Willie puts his hands on my dad's face. Oh, Larry, it's so nice to see you. Witnesses this interaction. And a little while later, Steven Spielberg comes over and he says, my dad and I were kind of leaning against the wall in conversation. And he comes up and says, excuse me, Berras, I'm so sorry. I don't mean to interrupt, but would it be all right if, like, maybe when you have a minute, could one of you possibly introduce me to Willie Mays? And my dad was like, you're Steven freaking Spielberg. Like, walk over and introduce yourself. But Steven Spielberg was so in awe of Willie Mays that he would not go up without an introduction. And my dad was like, all right, I can do that. So it was just a really cool day getting to hang out with all those folks.
Where is the Steven Spielberg baseball movie? We've got to see that. Right? I know. We do see a lot of luminaries in this doc, Sean. We saw them, especially even in those closing credits. Who did you have to get to talk on camera?
Well, outside the family, obviously. Vin Scully was an immediate must get because he was, 92.
Yeah.
So we did start with some of the older folks, and we've lost, I don't know if you saw in the credits, but we've lost a handful of those, of the people we've interviewed since then. Audrey Garagiola was a big one to get. So we started kind of with some of the older folks, but then, some of the key gets, Torrey, you can't really tell us over that, Joe Torrey. And once we had Torrey, then we were able to get Jeter and Mariano and all that, and then Billy Crystal and, Bob Costas. So we kind of went, there's a little bit of a pecking order with some of this stuff sometimes. Is this real? It's an independent film too, right? There's not an most sports related documentaries are ESPN or HBO. They're free, they're commissioned. So we were just we were just kind of sort of coming, and we had the blessing of the family, which was a big deal, and having Lindsay call ahead was a big deal. But still they had to take a leap of faith that this was going to turn out not horrible.
Do you learn anything just from hearing like Derek Jeter talk about your granddad, like anything like that, like hearing from a sports perspective?
I think you just learn like what an impact he had on people.
Yeah.
As Joe Torre says it all the time. You'd be watching games with Grandpa. He'd be sitting in the dugout at spring training, or even just sitting on the couch at home. He noticed things about ball games that people just don't see.
Yeah.
And that's what he gave to the Jeters and Swishers of the world. Nick had a terrible spring training, and he literally was like 0 for 40 or something. And he tells a story about Grandpa just telling him something about his hands and moving up in the box, and he ended up having like his best season, and it credits the little tips that Grandpa gave him. So it's just cool to see how, they say all the time that players nowadays are so much better than the players back then, and the players back then couldn't play today, and yada yada yada. But it's really neat to see how Grandpa, who is a player from back then, had an impact on the players of today.
And I assume, did he follow the Yankees till his last breath? I would imagine, like very attuned to what was going on in
100%.
baseball. And what was his most controversial opinion?
I don't know, but I want to add to your one thing about how players felt about Dad. I played on the 1985-86 Yankees, and my dad was the manager in 1985. So I played with Willie Randolph and Don Baylor and Ricky Henderson and Dave Winfield and Willie Randolph and Don Mattingly. Those were my teammates, Ron Guidry. So, I saw what they felt about my dad. I sat in the back of the plane while my dad sat in the manager's seat in the front of the plane. I sat in the back of the plane and I heard the players talking about dad. And I heard the players talking about dad when we went out at night and went out to dinner. They absolutely loved him. They cherished him. They liked him. They loved him because not as a manager, they loved him as a human being and as a person, and how much and how much that my dad cared for them. It wasn't unusual for a guy like Dave Righetti to get knocked out in the ninth inning of a game and lose the game. And Dad would go knock on his door after the game and just ask him, "Are you all right, kid? I just want to make sure you're all right." I mean, no manager does that. My dad did that with guys all the time. He would stop them in the elevator and just say, "Hey, come here. Don't you worry about a thing. Don't worry about this or that. I just want to make sure you're okay. Are you all right?" Put his arm around him. He just did it naturally. Players absolutely loved him, and it killed him when he got fired.
When you rattle off those names, like Baylor, Mattingly, Gidry, like all the guys who were on that team, it is amazing that George Steinbrenner didn't have enough faith in thinking that you guys would like turn around and go on a big old winning streak. It's crazy.
Yeah, I know what's going to happen.
But ultimately, they made up. And you've said that, I mean, the Steinbrenners, you're in touch with them. You have a great relationship with them.
So it's actually I had a press screening in Tampa in the middle of March, and it was for the Yankees press that was in spring training, and I invited Jennifer Steinbrenner and Christina Steinbrenner, Hal's wife, and they came, and I was sitting next to them, and I know what's in the movie, and I was like, oh my God, wait a minute, maybe I shouldn't have sat right next to them. Is this going to be really awkward? But I asked, and I said that to Jenny afterwards. I was like, when I sat down next to you, like 20 minutes in the movie, I was like, oh snap, I'm going to have to watch the part about her dad and that really awkward interview where that guy is like, but do you have regrets? Do you have regrets? It was funny. I love that guy. But she said, she was like, first of all, she said she didn't know a lot about that time because she was kind of off having babies and whatnot.
Right.
And she said that it was part of Grandpa's story and it was part of her father's story and it needed to be told. And she had no problem with it whatsoever. And she was like, it was part of their journey. And at the end of the journey, they were all back together and everything was fine. So God bless.
Yeah, I mean, if they wouldn't have reconciled, it would have been a different thing, obviously. But that reconciliation was very pure. And as Lindsay said a billion times, once the reconciliation happened, it was over. Yogi was good. That's all he wanted was that apology. That's it. And he got it. And he was at the stadium for the rest of his life.
Can you talk a little bit more about that perfect game, 99 that we see, 98, 99 that we see on screen? What was it like being there?
Well, that can't happen. That's the way I look at it. I mean, here's a guy, Don Larson and Yogi Berra team up for the perfect game, the only perfect game in World Series history. And on his special day, welcoming back to Yankee Stadium, our entire family is there. All dignitaries are there. All of his old teammates are there. And you got Larson and Berra. He goes to Joe Girardi at home plate and says, "Let me have your glove, kid." He takes Girardi's glove and he catches the ceremonial perfect game pitch from Larson, reenacting the '56 World Series. He gives the glove back to Girardi. We go up in the press box, and Cone and Girardi proceed to hook up for a perfect game on Yogi Berra Day after reenacting the perfect game ceremony. That can't happen in real life. It can only happen to Yogi Berra. That's the way I look
Sean
at
always
it.
says that if this was a dramatic movie and he had scripted that whoever was producing the movie would have said, no, this is
No way.
ridiculous. Forget it.
No, that can't happen.
No, I come from the scripted world, and this is only my second documentary, so I'm just getting going on these things. But if this wasn't a script, there have only been 23 perfect games in the history of baseball. And there's been tens of thousands of games played. We actually tried to shoehorn that quote in there, it stopped up the movie. But yeah, I mean, it was beyond believable, really. And it's one of those things too that we're so happy to have this film play in theaters. And please tell everybody if you like this to come see it in the theater, because that perfect game to me is something that on the page feels like I'd read it. People had read it, like, oh, Yogi Berra Day, another perfect game. Wow, what a coincidence. It's interesting on the page, but when you see it on the screen, it's actually emotional, right? It's like, because you've been through it all. That's why we're all here, you know. That's why we're doing this and telling stories with, you know, a communal setting, you know.
And it's crazy because everyone here, I'm sure, knows what's going to happen. That he's going to throw that perfect game, and it's still like suspenseful.
I still get I've seen this film 1,000 times. I still get chills. Yeah,
it's crazy. It makes you want to like rewatch the whole thing. It's just relive it.
I was there.
Wow. All right. Awesome.
So were we.
So were they.
Cool.
I was not. I was not.
Did you like move out of your seat after like the fourth inning? Were you like riveted and yeah?
Glued in our seats.
It's funny. I've watched it a few times now, you know, for the edit and like the commercial breaks. Robert RFK was missing the flight. That was like what was going on that day. I don't know. It's so funny. Robert Kennedy. Yeah, it was that day.
Wow.
I don't know. What random fact.
JFK
JFK Jr. I'm sorry. What did I say? I'm so sorry. JFK Jr. was missing. Yeah, at that day. It's a busy day in the news. But no, I wish I could have been there. But yeah, you know, real time capsule.
Before we're going to get to some audience questions, don't worry. Last question for you. I mean, we have talked about this, but it's worth repeating. I mean, everyone here is of a certain age, but there are people who don't know who Yogi Berra is. There are kids who just love the Yankees and love to watch Aaron Judge, whatever. Not whatever. Okay. And
Whatever.
what should they take away from watching a movie like this and watching the story of Yogi Berra?
They can watch a man who exercised incredible humility, generosity, respect, and did it all, basically his humility and gratitude and thankfulness. There are many times when Dad was, in his later years, when he was in the nursing home even, and I'd go to visit him, and his voice was barely audible, where he couldn't even see the TV in front of me, in front of him. Couldn't see the watch on his hand. Couldn't tell time anymore. Was completely disoriented. And I would say something, I'd say, Dad, let's talk about baseball. Tell me about the 7th game of 1960 World Series. And out of the blue, his voice would all of a sudden get strong, and he goes, if Kubek doesn't get hit in the throat by that ground ball, we turn 2 and we win that series. And I'm telling you, that's how perfectly acute he was. He remembered things in that manner. So what was I talking about that I said?
what to take away from the movie? Humility and
Oh yeah.
I was just gonna say, you know, like I think Grandpa would have lived an amazing life if he'd never set foot on a baseball field. And as Dale said, he just was such an example for how to live your life. I think this is very funny. When we premiered the film at Tribeca, a person came up to Sean at the after party and said, "This film has inspired me to be nicer to my wife." And I mean, we don't know what was going on there, but you know, if you watch this film, if young kids watch this film and it just inspires them to be a little better, be a little nicer in whatever area of their life, I think that's Grandpa's legacy, and that's amazing.
And I was going to say, now I remembered what I was going to say. I got into, talking about Dad, talking about little things. He could talk about the clubhouses and the clubhouse men and sitting in the lobbies in Chicago and talking. I mean, literally, that's how vivid his memory was even at that time. But when I reminded him or I told him and said, Dad, I said, what an amazing career you had. The first thing out of his mouth was always, I was blessed. I was very lucky. He never talked about himself, ever. And in our household growing up, he never talked about himself. To be honest, my brothers and I didn't know how good Dad was. We had to be told how good he was because he would never tell us.
All right, let's take a few questions. We all know that you loved it, so we're doing questions as opposed to comments, please. So just the questions. Go ahead.
Yes, my son could be here. He's
Sure.
34. Jake, as a single mother, we live not too far from the stadium, and we do this all in the car, when we're out there, and we since we go on game to game. Second and the fourth music. He's everything tonight, and baseball and Yankees, just everything. I just wish you could be here. Since he's not here, I just wanted to ask Lindsay and Dale if you could share with him, he wants me to ask you, just a memory you you've already done, but just share with them and then they, you have, you know, your dad, it's like anything.
I remember my mother and dad's relationship. That's what I remember. More than anything, I remember, I mean, I've seen a lot now. I mean, and looking back, what I remember most is the way that my dad looked at my mom, the way my mom looked at my dad, and how that lasted for 60 years. And I saw it in front of me and didn't think a thing of it as a kid because I didn't know any better. My brothers and I watched a love affair between two people. There was no tension in the house. It was just an amazing thing to watch those two as two lovebirds growing up as a little kid. And when I look back on it, that's what I remember the most about him is the relationship between my mom and dad. Well, that was just, it was only for 15 days, but it was great. I mean, that's all I can tell you.
Go Yankees.
I mean, I would echo what Dale said. Their relationship was really something to watch. And even as a little kid, I understood that and knew that my parents they got divorced when I was 5, and I spent a lot of time with my grandparents, and it was a very stark contrast to my parents yelling at each other. So I knew what a special thing that was. But my most treasured memories of my Grandpa Yogi are just like normal grandpa-granddaughter memories. Like the grandkids used to go over the day before Christmas, the day before Thanksgiving, and roll meatballs with him. We would make like a million little meatballs that my grandmother would put in this giant pot that we would all eat with toothpicks. Dale ate his fair share of those meatballs. And you know, like decorating the Christmas tree, we'd all go over. Grandma would pick a night and make like a big pot of macaronis or something. And like I have memories like where you can like I'm little and I can like feel Grandpa picking me up to put ornaments up high on the tree. Used to burn all the hot dogs at our family barbecues, right? You know that. And we would play wiffle ball and touch football. And we had a croquet set. We'd play croquet in the front yard. You know, just at home memories, watching boxing matches on TV in the den.
And then, of course, it was always the yogiisms that came out of his mouth that me, Larry, and Timmy didn't document, but they came out flowingly. I remember when Dad got inducted into the Hall of Fame, we were driving to the Hall of Fame. And Dad, of course, got a little bit off track and missed a road. And my mom said to Dad, "Yogi, you're lost." He goes, "Yeah, but we're making good time." So that's a typical one. And there's very often we'd be watching a play on TV or football, or if something happened funny, he would say, if Casey Stengel was alive today, he'd roll over in his grave.
Go ahead in the first row.
I recognize you, by the way. I saw you there. Yeah.
This is my second time.
Yeah.
Oh, great. I hope
We're very grateful for your butt in the seats.
Thank you very much, by the way.
I have to make a comment. I just appreciate you opening the film and I appreciate your honesty and sharing the difficult times in life. Thank you. Questions on Sean. You said it. We had a party. I was at a party.
National Board of Review screening, right?
You said at our screening that you would see. Somehow it came out of the equation Q&A. You had this idea of young boys seeing this film and coming to this understanding of what it is to be there. And I really appreciate that. I'm very given the thought to the filmmakers. One of the many things that I appreciate about this film is how you're so inclusive in your interviewees. You know, it's difficult. To me, it's impossible to tell a story about baseball without including Yogi Berra and Willie Mays and Jackie Robinson and that game and Dowdy and say. But you brought in interviewees who were people of color, and I would like to get a sense from you how easy it was, how difficult it was, how strategic you were in doing that. It was the whole thing together. Because filmmakers often say, well, I don't know how to be inclusive. I don't know how to address the
Oh, well, thanks so much. I mean, I think, you know, a lot of it's just how you're raised, right? My parents raised me. Everybody's the same. I mean, I was never, you know, I was in the military as well. And, you know, the military desegregated before baseball, before America, right? And so I've just always grown up with people of all different backgrounds, all different races. So for me personally, it was not. It was no different than just like who got the best stories of the day, and just leaning into that. But I appreciate you pointing that out, and I think a way to be inclusive is just to be open and not to be biased against anybody, and just really lean in. And we were really lucky to have a really diverse group. I mean, I think it really, honestly, at the end of the day, it was Yogi was the one who was.
That's what I was gonna say.
Yeah.
My dad was the
like-
one. I mean, the reason that we moved to Montclair, New Jersey, was because of the diversity of the town. My mom and my dad insisted upon that. It just so happened that my best friend growing up was Larry Doby Jr., who is shown in the film constantly. And I spent most of my time at Nishawane Park in Montclair, which happened to be pretty much an all-black park, and never once was the word, the fact that I was down there and playing with black kids and black kids were playing was never even mentioned or talked about. It was not even part of the dialogue. It's just the way Dad was. He respected, and I can tell you a story. Jackie Robinson told me in 1946, Jackie Robinson played with Montreal. Yogi Berra played with Newark in AAA. This is before either one of them was called to the big leagues. Dad happened to be catching. He was an outfielder catcher. He happened to be catching in Montreal the day that Jackie Robinson came to the plate. My dad threw dirt on his shoes. And Jackie looked back at him and said, "What?" Kind of looked at him cross-eyed. And Dad said, "Welcome to organized baseball and thank you for your service." That's in 1946, before they even got called to the big leagues. And Jackie told me that story and told me that Dad was the first white ball player to welcome him to organized baseball and to thank him for his service to the country. And if you watch the films of any Dodger Yankee World Series, every time Jackie comes to the plate, my dad picks up a little dirt, throws it on his shoe, and they smile at each other. And that went on for an entire decade.
He did look safe, though.
Well, that's
It's funny that
Lindsay-
archival footage from the flip side
Yeah,
does
no, the
definitely
first-
make him look safe. But I honestly Grandpa insisted till the day he died that Jackie was out. But I will echo this whole thing and just say I always say to people, it really doesn't matter if he was safe or out. What matters with Jackie Robinson is that he was in the big leagues and the big leagues being integrated, I think, pushes the civil rights movement in the country. I don't think we get where we got as a country with the civil rights movement without baseball doing it first, without the military doing it before that. And in is much more important than safe or out.
Absolutely. All right, let's do a couple more. I think there's someone in the back right there.
Okay.
Yes, yes.
Did Yogi have any opinions on the new Yankee Stadium? Because like Jeter said, the old one had like ghosts and like memories.
Did Yogi have any opinions on the new Yankee Stadium?
I don't think did you see the new?
He saw Nunu, because it was 2008. He was there a bunch, but I don't know that we
All-Star
really.
game, he might have been there.
The old stadium. The old stadium was really the new stadium was really the old stadium,
Oh, I know.
and the new stadium is not the old new stadium.
We got a yogism right
That's a
here.
young-
I remember him telling me. I do remember something. So when he went the first time he went to the new stadium and came back, he told me that you could throw an 80-yard touchdown pass in the clubhouse. That's how big the clubhouse was
The old
in the new stadium.
Okay, the new stadium. The new old stadium, which was refurbished, still had the bowels of the stadium, was still old Yankee Stadium. So when Dad used to go down the elevator, he was in very familiar grounds because the tunnels, the hallways, the lock, everything, nothing changed. Just the outside. So, I mean, it really was
The standing
the new
water in
old
the
Yankee
clubhouse.
Stadium.
All right, let's do one more. Go ahead.
So I am not a sports fan. I am a writer, and I'm here because I've quoted you very many books. And I'm so fascinated to hear that he did not speak English until he was 10. So talk a little about that, and how did it tell you, how do you think that influenced his lexicon and the way of his syntax, his way of putting together words?
I don't know. Lindsay can answer that after
I
me.
think, so they spoke Italian at home. His parents didn't speak English. He was
Yeah,
speaking
sorry, I'm gonna
English.
repeat
And
the
it was
question really
also a
quick.
very northern Italian dialect. From
Just to repeat the question, given that Yogi didn't speak English till he was 10, how did that affect like, his Yogi-isms later in life?
who knows?
I don't really have an answer to that, but he did. His parents didn't speak English. He spoke Italian at home. They encouraged him to speak English out of the house because they wanted the kids to be kind of Americanized. Grandpa definitely still understood Italian, like, you know, if there were waiters or something speaking it, but he would answer them in English later in life. But as far as how it influences syntax, I don't think I know Italian well enough to answer that question.
All right, well, it's over. Thank you for coming.
Please tell your friends and family to check out the movie. It's important this weekend. Oh, thank